It is with GEA. We continue because Paul Flynn, who's the CEO of the GPA, wrote a piece in the Irish Times yesterday revealing that 60% of the GPA membership support a tiered championship structure. And Paul, we wanted to get your thoughts on that. So thanks a million for taking our call this morning.
No problem, lads. How are things?
All is good. And there's some interesting stuff from John Horan in the papers this morning as well. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it. We might come to that in a little bit, but we did want to talk to you about the figures, and that's the reason we have you on. Obviously, a percentage figure can be misleading, so I was just looking to see if we could get some detail on that. Like, you assume maybe 100% of the top counties are in favour of it. Is there any detail on what that tiered structure would mean, firstly, and secondly, what percentage of players from the weaker counties are behind it?
Yeah, I know, and you can take surveys, you can take them in isolation, but we followed up with a focus group as well with kind of some of the key individuals that are responsible for it. But like when you look at the survey as is, and just kind of segment out, say the lower tier teams or Division 3 and Division 4 teams, 60% of those have highlighted that they're not satisfied with the current structures. So, you know, as the kind of article suggested, that the hurling championship, it was a great success this year, and the players are happy with the structures and the number of games that they're getting to play throughout the season. But it is with the lower tier football teams in Division 3 and Division 4 that there is the dissatisfaction with the number of games in particular they're getting to play against teams of similar quality, but also the number of games they're getting to play overall. And even when we had the focus group set up, it was interesting that, like, you know, this is a very difficult, there's so many different people's opinions on this. So we're trying to get as close to objective, you know, feedback from our members as possible. But even at that, in the focus group, everyone wasn't agreed on a proposal going forward, but they were agreed that they wanted to have input on it. When the GAA are coming with a proposal, that they'd love to be involved. So that focus group now is active, and they're happy to put their hand up and to give whatever guidance and support that is required to be able to come up with a structure that is suitable for all. So,
what sort of a response level do you get to these things, Paul? Is it is it mandatory that all counties give in some sort of response, or can there end up being a bit of a gap in some of those teams?
Yeah, it's a good point. And like, sometimes you can do surveys and you can get a low response rate, but for this one in particular, we just shy of 600 respondents, with a minimum of 3 per team across all teams, 67 teams, up as far as 12 and 13 with regards to some squads. So, and that's a good response rate for ourselves, over 2,300 members. So it is a good representation, and it makes the findings reliable, as well as valid. So it just shows that there is, you know, it's an area where people want to have their voice heard. Some surveys we might not get the same response rate, and that's why we felt it was very appropriate for us to come out with the findings.
Paul, it's Dave here. I was actually surprised by the number of 53% of footballers feeling that the competition format allowed for a sufficient number of games against teams of equal standard. I'm curious as to what teams would actually feel that way, because there are so many one-sided games. The top teams outside of the National League don't really get to play each other until the All-Ireland quarter-finals. I know that's changed with the round-robin series, but anyone outside of the teams that make the Super 8s, they simply do not get to play any games, bar the odd maybe Leinster Championship match of the opening round of fixtures against team of their standard. 53% just seems quite low for me, and I know you say, and the GPA are saying, that things have moved on from the last time a similar survey was done, but I would have thought that would have been much closer to 60 or 70%. What are your thoughts on 53%?
Yeah, it's a good point, and like, again, you're just dealing. There's so many opinions out there, and even yesterday I heard Eoin speaking with Jer about it, about what would the proposed structure look like, and they couldn't agree. So this is this is down to people's consensus. Ultimately, this is just the findings from our members, and that's what they've highlighted. Whether I'm not here to say, I think it should be higher or it should be lower. The figures are the figures, and that's why we are here to kind of highlight that there is an appetite for change. There's definitely some dissatisfaction amongst our members, and the most dissatisfied group is the Division 3 and Division 4 squads, when we segment the information. So I suppose that's kind of, it's telling in itself, but it's time now to kind of really have a look at it in more detail.
Yeah, like one of those proposals that we were chatting about yesterday was that Wicklow proposal, which the Irish Independent carried last week, that they want to propose a tiered championship, which would see counties compete in their own provinces and then drop into a second tier championship if they don't reach their own provincial final, should they be in Division 3 or 4. Like, is there a sense that the 60% it will be a higher number than, say, 10, 15 years ago, that even when we have gone into previous tiered championships which haven't worked, which have failed quite spectacularly, I would say, is there kind of a full sea change in perception of how these things would go now in the future?
A sea change, I'm not too sure on, but there is a definite shift in the players' views, and as I highlighted a number of years back, they boycotted a second tier championship of any kind, but I think it is about having input into it on, and I think that's the crucially important part of it. If players feel that like they had their say before the proposal was presented to them, they are crying out for more games. They want the games to have coverage and also to be incentivised. And if there's a structure like the Wicklow structure, it gives them the opportunity to enter into the front door. But then there's another championship afterwards. Or if it was one where it was two different competitions, there has to be an opportunity for promotion. So I think there's so many kind of different angles you can look at this. All we're saying is that, when they are looking at those angles, that they have player input in it.
Paul, I was picking up, rightly or wrongly, a sense of sort of frustration from you in the piece yesterday. I know that you'd been into the CCC maybe last week to present your proposals around some of those tiered changes, and I know you're very keen on, obviously, player-centred involvement in all of this. Have you any indication post that presentation that the GA are going to engage any more with you on the mandate, as you put it in the piece?
Yeah, and in fairness, when we went in and we presented the findings to the CCCC, they were happy with the findings. With regards to the fact that it was, again, I go back to it, it was the players' opinion. It wasn't just our opinion coming in and saying this is what we feel. And they respected that. It was only 2 weeks ago, and I'm sure they're going to meet up in the next couple of weeks. But we are continuously speaking with GPA to highlight what we propose for the next steps around a task force being set up around using the lads, the voice of the members, and as I said, there's the focus group there. We're continually speaking to them around this, and the GAA have the opportunity to utilise that as well. But not only around the tiered championship, I think there's some bigger issues as well around April and the close season that need to be addressed, and I think they can be addressed even quicker than some of the other issues. So they're some of the key findings that we found, and we want to kind of have, as I said, the players' input into the changes that are going to happen.
Just on that April club month, because you made a very good point that we often kind of overlooked over the last couple of weeks, that from a student perspective, it's a terrible time to have to train with your club, train with your county, and of course have your assignments and preparations for exams in that month as well. And you point out as well the huge numbers of people who just didn't have an off season going into this year. And Eoin Cormacan was writing in the Irish Examiner last week. He had surveyed all the county boards around Ireland, and a lot more counties this year are actually playing their county finals a lot later in the year, despite the fact that we've had early county finals. What would you suggest would be the fix to this, to actually finally getting county boards up and running in terms of moving those county finals forward? Because the earlier All-Ireland finals on a county level and the club month of April just hasn't done it this year.
I know, and so we have had 50 of our, as highlighted, 50 of the squads who highlighted that they didn't have a club only April. Now the only thing I will say about it is in Dublin we did, and I went back for the whole month of April, played exclusively with the club. The club lads actually didn't realise, they were like, "What's going on here? You've been here for the whole month with no break in it." But however, we didn't have a game until 3 months into May. 3 weeks into May. Okay, so that gave us enough time to prepare for a game. Some of the teams had a game 1 week and 2 weeks into May, which doesn't give enough time to prepare. So I suppose it's not just about April in isolation. It's about the weeks after April into May, that will have a big bearing on how in their county teams will release their players or not. And as highlighted report as well around our students, like yourself, like the demands that are placed not just on assignments but continuous assessment exams as well, and travelling up and down to back to your club and county within that month just makes the demands unsustainable. So that's why it's important to highlight, like, on top of that, a small reference towards ongoing chronic injuries that are related to not having enough rest and recovery. And we've the GPA have a kind of group set up called a Player Safety and Welfare Group. It's chaired by Dr. Jim O'Donovan, and some of the findings coming out of that are very striking. Like 1 in 3 of our members have had significant hip or groin injuries over the past number of years, and over 200 of them had to have surgical interventions. And I'm one of those players. Like I had a groin operation. There's a number of lads on that I know have groin operations, and they're down to chronic injuries and not having enough time to rest and recover. And with no off season and with a congested April, that only compounds that.
Paul, we did mention that we hadn't planned to speak to you about it, and it wasn't the basis that you came on, but it'd be remiss of us not to ask you about the John Horan comments in some of the papers this morning. I don't know if you've seen them, but he's had his say, I suppose, on the general violence that we've seen around some of the club games, particularly obviously over the last few weeks. And there was some of the quotes that jumped out for us that were specifically about the local organising committees taking charge within each county to dish out any disciplinary action that should arise out of those, and that it's only a small number of games. We've just been discussing how for us they probably haven't gone far enough in how strong they are. I don't know if you've seen them or what your reaction to them is.
Apologies, lads. I didn't get an opportunity to see the papers this morning. However, I have seen obviously a number of the incidents that have been going on, and I think a lot of them they're being caught on camera a lot more now, and going viral. But I suppose this is a GAA related issue as opposed to a GPA related issue. However, I think it's our responsibility to promote respect and fair play in the games, and maybe it's something that we can kind of continue to promote amongst our members, and hopefully then that'll, as role models for our game, that'll have an impact then feeding down into the club scene.
Yeah, is there a role for the GPA to play in it, Paul? Because like it feels almost at the minute like as if, and I do appreciate that it isn't there's no onus on you obviously and the organisation to step in and do anything about it necessarily, but it does feel a little bit at the minute as if it's a kind of a runaway train and nobody's saying stop here.
Yeah, I know, and as I was saying, like around the role models piece is important. And like take our members, 2,300 of them, and within their club, within their village, they're all individually, they're all role models for the game, and they're advocates of the game. And it's important that we continue to be promoting respect, fair play within our games. But I do think that there has to be sanctions put in place that will make incidents like this be punished accordingly, and which hopefully then that'll help have the stop point on it as well. Yeah,
definitely. Like I'm not sure about from a first perspective. Like certainly in the last couple of months from the club games, Dublin hasn't really been a factor here. So maybe you haven't seen it up close and personal. But even from your county days, one of the issues that really gets to me, Paul, is just the constant baiting of opponents, the goading, and the little sparks that kind of get lit that start these brawls. It certainly happened from viewing it firsthand. That's what happened to start the Kerry brawl last Sunday. Now, I'm not excusing some of the violence that happened afterwards, but it was ultimately what started a little bit of niggle. From your own perspective, how annoying is that? I'm sure you've seen it up close and personal, your teammates, yourself perhaps hearing that verbals, or perhaps some of your teammates giving out those verbals, like kind of that culture change that perhaps is required to actually nip this in the bud.
Yeah, and I suppose in the inter-county game, you've got officials, you've got on the sidelines and umpires that, they play their part in the club scene. You may only have one man and in the middle of a pitch with 30 players and then another maybe 30 on the sidelines. It can be, hard to control. But I do feel that if it comes down to rules and implementing them, and if we are strict on, all the little niggles that you're highlighting on, and just kind of punish them, it will be a culture change then. Like if you look at sports like rugby, where discipline is quite good, but it's because of referees demand control of the games, and I think that if we can get to that stage, it'll only be good for both inter-county game but also the club.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think some of the criticism, like I've been particularly harsh this morning on like Gaelic games, clubs and things like that, but ultimately GAA people aren't more violent than rugby people, or they aren't more violent than soccer people. That would be a ridiculous thing to say. What it is that there is just less of a culture of respect to your opponent on the pitch. Is that fair to say, Paul?
Is it fair? I think that everybody does respect, the opponents. However, I just think, and it can sometimes get heated. And as I said, like if there's one man in the middle of a pitch and there's 30 players, it's happened for as long as I remember. I think that it's coming to light now. Like, I remember playing underage football, and there'd be a number of melees of sorts like this. So it's not something that's just happened overnight. That's not saying that it's right. I'm just saying that it has happened for years, for as long as I can remember, either going to games or playing playing our games. It has happened, but that doesn't say it's right. It does need to stop. But again, it's probably more down to the GAA, and I'm sure they're in control of it.
Paul, good to chat to you. Thanks a million for taking the call this morning.
Thanks, lads. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot. Paul Flynn there, CEO of the GPA, and his reaction to the piece yesterday, obviously his own piece.